I never thought a 3-year war with my HOA president Brenda McLaughlin over garden hoses, doormat colors, and mailbox angles would end with her demanding a SWAT team to inspect my curtains. My name is Mark Harrison, and that Tuesday morning, HOA Karen dialed 911 lying through her teeth about me being heavily armed and barricaded because I refused to open the door to her inspection and demanding helicopter evacuation. The calm, professional voice answering her hysterical call belonged to my wife, Sarah, and Sarah was about to give this petty tyrant exactly what she was begging for. When Sarah and I first made the move to Willow Creek Estates, the initial impression was one of unblemished perfection. The lawns were all impeccably neat, like green velvet carpets rolled out before each house. The neighbors we encountered in those early days offered friendly waves and warm smiles, contributing to an overall sense of order that felt wonderfully peaceful, a welcome change after years spent navigating the cramped, often chaotic realities of apartment living. We were, it turns out, naive enough, perhaps even a little desperate for tranquility, to believe that this pervasive order stemmed from a foundation of mutual respect among residents, rather than a less palatable alternative, like fear. Brenda McLaughlin quickly shattered our illusion of peace. In her late 50s, she had found purpose in a clipboard, an HOA badge, and the power that came with them, perhaps for the first time in her life. She wore pastel pantsuits like armor and moved with a self-righteous confidence. Her stiff, perfectly set perm looked like it could survive a hurricane, just like her determination to control everything around her. But Brenda wasn't just someone who was strict about the rules, who insisted on dotting every I and crossing every T in the community bylaws. Her enforcement went beyond mere adherence to regulations. She was, to put it plainly, cruel in her application of them. I saw just how cruel Brenda could be about 3 months after we moved in. She suddenly decided that Mrs. Chen's 8-year-old granddaughter was riding her small, colorful bike too aggressively around the quiet neighborhood. Instead of calmly talking to the family, Brenda took a much harsher route. She filed a formal complaint to the HOA, calling the child a significant safety hazard and demanding that the family be fined. When Mr. Chen, a kind and quiet man, tried to explain that his granddaughter was just playing, Brenda dismissed him coldly. She even implied that people from his cultural background might not fully understand or respect American property values. It was a shocking and offensive comment that showed just how far she was willing to go to assert her control. The little girl, understandably, stopped riding her bike outside in the neighborhood after that incident. The joy had been leached from that simple childhood pleasure. I watched in disbelief as Brenda ruined the neighborhood's annual block party, once a highlight of summer in Willow Creek. Instead of joining the fun, she arrived with a clipboard and measuring tape, treating the event like an inspection. She went from table to table, checking their distance from the curb to match some obscure rule. One family's setup was only 2 inches off, but Brenda still made them move everything, tables, chairs, food, and decorations, right in front of everyone. It embarrassed the hosts and disrupted the entire event. The party ended early, and after that, we never had another one. Brenda's strict, joyless enforcement of rules had killed a beloved community tradition. Brenda once called animal control on the Martinez family's elderly golden retriever, claiming the dog barked too much and disturbed the neighborhood. In reality, the dog was nearly deaf and barely made a sound except for a quiet woof now and then. After a full investigation, animal control found no issue at all, but the experience was so stressful that Mr. Martinez, who already had heart problems, ended up in the hospital with chest pains. When Brenda found out, she didn't express any concern. Instead, she coldly told neighbors that if someone couldn't handle owning a pet, maybe they shouldn't have one. Her lack of empathy was shocking. This, then, was the woman, Brenda McLaughlin, who had apparently decided, for reasons known only to herself, that I, a relatively new and, I thought, unobtrusive resident, was to be her next designated target. My first truly direct and personal encounter with Brenda's unique brand of HOA enforcement came approximately 6 months after Sarah and I had moved into Willow Creek. It was a pleasant, sunny Sunday afternoon, and I was peacefully watering my front garden, enjoying the warmth and the quiet hum of the sprinklers. Suddenly, she appeared at my mailbox, materializing almost out of thin air, her clipboard held firmly in front of her like a shield. She announced my name, Mr. Harrison, without bothering with any pleasantries. She then declared that my garden hose had been visibly accessible from the street for a period exceeding 3 hours. The Homeowners Association regulations, she continued, her tone becoming increasingly officious, clearly and unequivocally stated that all garden hoses must be properly stored out of sight within a maximum of 3 hours of use. I glanced down at my watch, a slight frown creasing my brow. It had been, by my calculation, exactly 3 hours and perhaps 10 minutes since I had first started watering the various flower beds. I told her I was actually still using it, trying to keep my tone even and reasonable. I gestured towards the back lawn where a sprinkler was still diligently spinning, casting arcs of water across the grass. I assured her I would be sure to put it away properly as soon as I was finished with all the watering. Her eyes, already small and sharp, narrowed perceptibly. She retorted that the regulation did not specify active use as a mitigating factor. It specified, with no ambiguity, the maximum duration of visibility. I was, therefore, she concluded, currently in violation of said regulation. With a flourish, she handed me an official-looking notice, already filled out, I noted with a sinking feeling, as if she had been lurking somewhere nearby, stopwatch in hand, just waiting for this precise moment, this exact infraction. The violation, the notice informed me, came with an accompanying $50 fine. That's when I made my first significant mistake in dealing with Brenda McLaughlin. I asked to see the specific regulation she was citing in writing. I wanted to read the exact wording myself. Brenda's face, normally a pale, impassive mask, flushed a sudden angry red. She asked if I was questioning her authority as president of this homeowners association. I replied, striving to maintain a calm demeanor despite the rising tide of my own frustration, that I wasn't. I was simply asking to see the actual rule that she was citing in this instance. That seemed like a perfectly reasonable request to me. She pulled out her thick, dog-eared binder, the repository of all HOA wisdom, and began to flip through its numerous pages with an aggressive, almost violent energy. After several long, tense minutes of ostentatious searching, during which she huffed and puffed with theatrical impatience, she finally jabbed a finger at a particular section of densely printed text. The section was vaguely titled, Maintaining Neighborhood Aesthetics and Overall Property Appeal. She announced triumphantly that it said right there that all outdoor equipment, tools, and appurtenances should be stored properly and out of public view when not in active use. I pointed out, my voice still quiet but firm, that it said should, not must. There was a significant legal difference between those two words. And, I added, pressing my point, it didn't appear to mention any specific time limits for storage, certainly not a 3-hour window. The look she gave me then could have, I swear, melted steel. It was a gaze filled with pure, unadulterated animosity and a chilling sense of offended authority. She told me, her voice low and dangerously quiet now, that she had been the president of this homeowners association for 8 long years. She thought, she concluded, her lips curling into a disdainful sneer, that she knew precisely how to interpret their community regulations. I ended up paying the $50 fine, primarily to avoid any further immediate escalation, to simply make her go away. It was a tactical retreat, I told myself. But it was also the very last time I would ever make the mistake of underestimating Brenda McLaughlin or passively accepting her pronouncements without a fight. The battle lines, however subtly, had been drawn. After the hose incident, Brenda's focus on my property became obsessive. It was like that small argument triggered something in her. She began walking past our house several times a day, moving slowly, scanning everything. Our yard, our house, even the windows, like she might be trying to look inside. I often saw her taking photos from different angles, sometimes using a measuring tape to check distances or plant height. It felt like I was under constant surveillance. Every small thing on my property was being recorded as if I were breaking serious rules. The yellow violation slips started showing up almost every week. One was for our doormat, which Brenda claimed was the wrong shade of beige, Sahara sunset instead of the approved desert sand. I couldn't tell the difference. She also measured the distance from our mailbox to the curb and said it was a 1/4 inch off. Then came a warning about our grass being too tall, even though I had mowed it just 2 days before, and I knew she'd seen that. Every new violation, no matter how petty, came with a fine and a harsh letter. The wording made it sound like I was some kind of criminal. Brenda warned that if I kept disobeying, things would escalate, though she never said how. She claimed the community's integrity depended on strict rule following, clearly implying that I was the one putting everything at risk. But Brenda didn't stop at fines and notices. She started involving my neighbors, too. She sent them copies of my supposed violations, with handwritten notes hinting that I was hurting property values. She spread rumors that I was difficult, unfriendly, and a problem for the neighborhood. When the Hendersons invited us to their 50th anniversary party, Brenda made sure to whisper that I was under investigation by the HOA. The message was clear. Stay away from me if you value your reputation. The constant stress from Brenda's harassment was wearing me down. I started checking the street through the blinds before leaving the house, just to make sure she wasn't out there with her clipboard. I gave up gardening, something I used to love, because I was afraid she'd find something else to report. At night, I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake for hours, anxious about what new, made-up violation might show up on my door the next morning. Sarah watched my gradual deterioration with a growing, palpable concern. She told me one night, after I'd spent nearly an hour obsessing over whether our outdoor Christmas lights were hung at precisely the right HO-approved height, that Brenda was clearly bullying me. She said this wasn't normal HOA enforcement, not by any stretch of the imagination. This, she insisted, was personal. She was right, of course. I knew she was right. But I honestly didn't know how to effectively fight back against someone like Brenda without inadvertently making things even worse for myself. For us. Any direct confrontation seemed only to fuel her righteous indignation and escalate her attacks. Then things took a darker turn. Brenda wasn't satisfied with just HOA fines and warnings. She brought in outside authorities. About 6 months into her campaign, I came home after a long day at work and found a social services investigator waiting at my door. She looked serious and worn out, and I instantly knew something was very wrong. She introduced herself as Janet Morrison from Child Protective Services. She stated that they had received a report concerning potential safety hazards present in my home. My blood ran cold at her words. Safety hazards? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. We didn't even have children living with us. Miss Morrison consulted her notes, her expression carefully neutral. She informed me that the report had mentioned things like exposed electrical wiring, significant structural damage to the property, and even possible hoarding conditions. She explained that as per their protocols, she was required by law to investigate all such claims thoroughly. It took me a long, stunned moment to process what was actually happening, the sheer audacity of it. I asked her, my voice trembling slightly with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Who could have possibly made such a baseless and malicious report? Miss Morrison consulted her notes again. She replied that the complainant had, unfortunately, preferred to remain anonymous, but they had identified themselves to the agency as a concerned neighbor. I knew right away who the concerned neighbor was, Brenda. She had taken things beyond HOA rules and filed a false, serious report with a government agency. The inspection, just as I expected, found nothing wrong. Our home was clean, safe, and well kept. Still, the experience shook me deeply. Having a stranger inspect our home over a lie felt invasive and humiliating. The investigator, Miss Morrison, apologized for the mistake and the stress it caused. But it didn't change the fact that now my name was in a Child Protective Services file over a false accusation I'd never lived down. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time, the fire department showed up with sirens blaring, responding to a report of imminent fire hazards in our backyard. They found nothing dangerous, just our well-kept fire pit that we used now and then with friends. As they packed up, one of the fire inspectors, an older man with kind eyes, quietly told me it was obvious someone was messing with me on purpose. He said false reports like this were becoming a real issue. Some people were using emergency services just to harass their neighbors. I filed formal, detailed complaints with the HOA board about Brenda's escalating pattern of harassment and her dangerous abuse of official channels. But my efforts were, predictably, futile. She had, over her long tenure as president, carefully stacked the board with her loyal allies, individuals who either genuinely believed in her crusade or were too intimidated to challenge her. My complaints were summarily dismissed as unfortunate personality conflicts and simple misunderstandings. The board, in its infinite wisdom, actually suggested that I should try to work things out amicably with Brenda directly, as if that were a remotely feasible option. Against my better judgment, I tried. I formally requested a meeting with her, hoping against hope that perhaps, in a direct conversation, I could find some way to de-escalate the situation, to reach some kind of truce, some way to coexist peacefully in the same neighborhood. Brenda agreed to the meeting, but only on her terms. It had to be held in the community center, and only if other members of the HOA board were present as witnesses. The meeting, as I should have anticipated, was an unmitigated disaster. Brenda arrived armed with a folder so thick with photographs of my alleged violations, some of them dating back over a year, that it looked like a prosecutor's evidence binder. She proceeded to present these infractions to the assembled board members as if she were laying out the evidence in a high-stakes criminal trial, describing each one in minute, excruciating detail, painting a picture of me as a serial offender, a veritable blight on the community, someone who was single-handedly threatening the very foundation of civilized suburban life. She announced to the room, her voice ringing with self-righteous conviction, that Mr. Harrison had consistently, and with flagrant disregard, shown a complete lack of respect for established community standards. She declared that my property maintenance was, in her expert opinion, chronically substandard. My general attitude was unacceptably confrontational, and my continued presence in their otherwise pristine neighborhood was, without a doubt, detrimental to overall property values. When I attempted to defend myself, to offer explanations or context for any of the alleged violations, she cut me off abruptly, often mid-sentence. She grandly declared that she possessed meticulously compiled documentation of 17 separate and distinct violations in the past year alone. This, she proclaimed, was clearly not the behavior of a man who respected his neighbors or his community obligations. I looked around the room at the faces of the other board members. Some of them looked distinctly uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding my gaze, but none of them spoke up in my defense. None of them challenged Brenda's narrative. Her power, it was painfully clear, was absolute and seemingly unassailable. I left that meeting feeling more defeated and isolated than ever before. The constant, unrelenting stress was undeniably destroying my health. I developed a persistent, frustrating insomnia, finding myself lying awake for hours each night, my mind replaying Brenda's latest antics, wondering what new attack, what fresh indignity she would launch with the morning light. My appetite vanished almost completely. I lost a noticeable 15 pounds in just 2 short, miserable months. My job performance, something I had always taken great pride in, began to suffer noticeably as I found myself distracted, on edge, and perpetually anxious during the workday. Sarah, my wife, was worried enough about my deteriorating state to insist that I see our family doctor. Dr. Patterson, a kind and understanding physician, listened patiently to my litany of symptoms and promptly diagnosed me with an anxiety disorder. He recommended various stress management techniques, things like deep breathing exercises and mindfulness meditation, but the hard truth was that the root cause of my distress wasn't something that could be easily fixed with calming breathing, exercises, or a more positive outlook. The fundamental problem was the grim reality of living under the constant, oppressive threat of a woman who seemed utterly, almost gleefully determined to make my life as miserable as humanly possible. Sarah told me one evening, her voice filled with a quiet desperation, that I really needed to seriously consider the possibility of moving. This came after I'd spent nearly 2 hours pacing agitatedly around the house because Brenda had, yet again, left another violation notice on our door. This time, the egregious offense was that our porch light was, in her considered opinion, too bright and therefore disruptive to the neighborhood's nocturnal ambiance. I responded, perhaps a little too vehemently, that we shouldn't have to even think about moving. This was our home, I insisted. We had done absolutely nothing wrong to warrant being driven out. Sarah looked at me then, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. She acknowledged that she knew, but she also pointed out, gently but firmly, that Brenda was, quite literally, making me sick. She urged me to just look at myself, to see the man I had become. She said I was a mere shadow of who I used to be. She was right, of course. I barely recognized the tense, jumpy, paranoid, and utterly defeated man I saw reflected in the mirror each morning. Brenda, through her relentless campaign of harassment, had succeeded in making me feel like a prisoner, afraid and on edge, in my own home. The final, unendurable straw, the incident that pushed me beyond my limits of tolerance, came on a beautiful, sun-drenched Saturday morning in early spring. I was sitting peacefully on my front porch, enjoying a rare moment of quiet, drinking my morning coffee and attempting to read the newspaper, when Brenda appeared, like an unwelcome apparition, at the bottom of my driveway. She wasn't alone this time, which was a new and unsettling development. She had brought 2 other women from the neighborhood with her, a Mrs. Garrett and a Mrs. Fleming, both longtime Willow Creek residents who, from what I had observed, seemed to worship Brenda's authority with an almost cult-like devotion. Brenda called out my name, Mr. Harrison, her voice carrying with an unnerving clarity across the otherwise quiet morning air. She announced that they needed to discuss my ongoing and apparently escalating violations. I carefully set down my coffee cup, noticing with a detached sense of dismay that my hands had already started to shake. I asked her, trying to keep my voice even, what violations she was referring to this time. Brenda marched purposefully up my driveway, her 2 companions following closely behind her, like a pair of backup singers, or, perhaps more accurately, enforcers. She declared that my lawn furniture was not in compliance with the HOA's stringent aesthetic guidelines. She specifically pointed to the chair I was currently sitting in, stating that it was clearly visible from the street and appeared to be of a non-approved color. I looked down at my simple, unassuming wooden porch chair, which was stained a perfectly natural, unobtrusive brown. I told her, my voice laced with a weary disbelief, that it was a standard outdoor chair, the kind of thing one could buy at any Home Depot. She announced then, loud enough for any curious neighbors who might be within earshot to clearly hear, that the approved colors for all outdoor furniture were meticulously specified in Section 12 of the HOA covenants. Natural wood stain, she proclaimed with an air of irrefutable authority, was most definitely not on that approved list. Mrs. Garrett, one of her companions, nodded sagely at this pronouncement, as if Brenda had just revealed some profound, unassailable truth about the universe. Mrs. Fleming, the other woman, was busily taking photos of me and my offending chair with her phone, presumably documenting my latest transgression. I asked, my patience finally snapping, if she could possibly be serious. Was she actually going to fine me for the color of my porch chair? Brenda replied, her voice cold and unyielding. That rules were rules, Mr. Harrison. The fact that I, in her view, continued to resist compliance suggested a fundamental and deeply troubling disrespect for their established community standards. That's when she said something that would echo in my mind, haunting me for weeks to come. She suggested, her voice dripping with a venomous sweetness, that perhaps someone who couldn't or wouldn't follow simple community guidelines shouldn't be living in a family-oriented neighborhood like Willow Creek. She opined that there were undoubtedly other places, other communities, more suitable for people with my particular attitude problems. The threat, though couched in superficially polite language, was unmistakably clear. She wasn't just trying to control every minute detail of my property anymore. She was actively and openly trying to drive me out of the neighborhood entirely. I felt something vital, something essential, break inside me at that moment. After months upon months of relentless harassment, baseless false reports to outside agencies, and now this very public humiliation on my own doorstep, I had finally, irrevocably, reached my limit. I told her, my voice dangerously quiet but firm, to get off my property. Brenda actually smiled then, a cold, chillingly triumphant expression that made my skin crawl. She asked if I was threatening her, Mr. Harrison. I repeated my request for her to leave. I stated that this was my private property, and she had absolutely no right to be there, making demands about my furniture or anything else. She declared, her voice rising again in self-righteous indignation, that everything visible from the street was subject to HOA oversight. She asserted that she had every right to be there, conducting what she termed an inspection. I reiterated that she had no right to be on my private property without my express permission. I asked her, again, to please leave. Mrs. Garrett gasped audibly, as if I had just committed some terrible, unforgivable offense against God and country. Mrs. Fleming, meanwhile, continued to diligently take photos with her phone, probably planning to use them later as evidence of my aggressive and uncooperative behavior. Brenda's eyes glittered with a distinctly malicious satisfaction. She informed me, Well, Mr. Harrison, that if I was going to be hostile and uncooperative, she would, regrettably, have no choice but to report this unfortunate incident to the appropriate authorities. She then pulled out her own phone with a theatrical flourish, making absolutely sure that I could see precisely what she was doing, who she was ostensibly calling. I told her, trying desperately to keep my voice steady, to keep the tremor of rage and despair out of it, that was her choice to make. But, I added, she needed to leave my property. Now. What happened next? The events that unfolded on that otherwise peaceful Saturday morning would, I have no doubt, become something of a neighborhood legend, a story recounted with a mixture of disbelief and dark amusement for years to come. Brenda, standing there in my driveway with her phone pressed dramatically to her ear, began to perform what can only be accurately described as a veritable masterpiece of theatrical victimhood, a performance worthy of a daytime soap opera. She announced into the phone, her voice laced with a carefully manufactured tremor, that she was Brenda McLaughlin at 125 Willow Creek Drive. She stated that she needed immediate police assistance. She claimed with growing urgency that there was a dangerous, threatening individual at her location. I couldn't, of course, hear the dispatcher's response on the other end of the line, but I could vividly imagine Sarah's reaction, her professional composure, when she eventually realized what was happening, what kind of call this was. My wife, Sarah, had been handling 911 calls, dealing with every conceivable emergency for over a decade. She was a consummate professional, someone who took every single call with the utmost seriousness. But she also knew, better than almost anyone, how to effectively deal with individuals who abused the emergency system for their own personal agendas. Brenda continued her performance, her voice growing more dramatic with each passing second. She informed the dispatcher that he, meaning me, was refusing to comply with established community regulations. She insisted that he was being extremely hostile and undeniably aggressive. She declared, her voice cracking with feigned emotion, that she was genuinely deeply afraid for her personal safety. Mrs. Garrett and Mrs. Fleming, her loyal companions, nodded supportively throughout this monologue, playing their designated parts as concerned, corroborating witnesses with an unfortunate enthusiasm. Brenda then said, apparently responding to a question from the dispatcher, that yes, he absolutely could be dangerous. She opined that he had a very shifty, untrustworthy look about him. She wouldn't be at all surprised, she added ominously, if he were in fact armed. She urged them to send someone immediately before things escalated further. I realized then, with a dawning sense of both dread and a strange sort of detachment, that she was actively, deliberately digging herself into a hole, a very deep and potentially problematic hole. But I had, at that point, no idea just how deep that hole would ultimately go. Then, with a flair that bordered on the absurd, Brenda declared, her voice rising with a palpable, almost giddy excitement, that actually she thought this was rapidly developing into a barricade situation. She proclaimed that he had effectively locked himself on his property and was steadfastly refusing to comply with what she termed lawful orders. This, she warned, could escalate very quickly indeed. She paused for a moment, presumably listening to the dispatcher's response, her face a mask of feigned concern. "A SWAT team?" she repeated, her voice now filled with a mixture of alarm and something that sounded disturbingly like vindication. "Yes," she agreed. That sounded entirely appropriate given the circumstances. And, she added as an afterthought, she thought she herself might be in need of immediate medical attention. The sheer stress of dealing with this incredibly dangerous and unpredictable individual, she explained, was becoming overwhelming. She felt faint, she insisted. They might, she suggested, even need to send a helicopter to evacuate her safely from the scene. I watched, with a sense of utter, almost surreal amazement, as Brenda, before my very eyes, transformed a simple, petty dispute about property aesthetics into what sounded, to anyone listening on a police scanner, like a full-blown, life-threatening hostage situation. She was so completely caught up in her own dramatic performance, so enamored with the sound of her own escalating hysteria, that she didn't seem to realize, or perhaps simply didn't care, how utterly absurd and unbelievable her claims were becoming. With each passing embellishment, "Special forces," she added, her voice now practically vibrating with a strange, almost manic energy, "would be good too. One simply couldn't be too careful, she opined, with these types of individuals. She urged them to send everything they had, every available unit. 20 minutes later, the first police car arrived, its siren wailing, its lights flashing. Then another, then a third. The normally quiet, tranquil suburban street began to fill with the garish, flashing lights and the unsettling presence of multiple emergency vehicles. Brenda, it was clear, was in her absolute element. She was directing the arriving officers with the confident, authoritative air of a seasoned general commanding troops in a battlefield engagement. She pointed dramatically at my house, explaining to anyone who would listen, her voice filled with righteous indignation, that I was a dangerous, unhinged criminal who had effectively barricaded himself inside and was posing an imminent threat to overall community safety. More units arrived in a steady stream. A large, imposing fire truck, an ambulance, its lights adding to the chaotic scene. A police supervisor's SUV, its occupant looking grim and purposeful. The neighbors, predictably, began emerging from their houses, drawn by the undeniable commotion, their faces a mixture of curiosity, concern, and thinly veiled excitement. Then I heard it, the distinctive rhythmic whoop, whoop, whoop of helicopter rotors. A police helicopter, a genuine honest-to-goodness helicopter, began to circle slowly, ominously overhead, its powerful searchlight sweeping across the neighborhood in broad, incongruous daylight. Mrs. Henderson, our kind neighbor from across the street, looked visibly confused and clearly frightened by the unfolding spectacle. She called out to one of the officers, her voice thin with anxiety, asking what was happening, if Mark, meaning me, was dangerous. Brenda, ever opportunistic, immediately inserted herself into the conversation. She announced, loudly enough for everyone within a 50-foot radius to clearly hear, that he had been acting erratically, unpredictably, for months. She proclaimed that he had been consistently violating community standards, threatening board members, and stubbornly refusing to cooperate with lawful inspections. She added, for good measure, that she had been meticulously documenting everything, every single infraction. I realized then, with a sickening lurch in my stomach, that I needed to somehow end this escalating farce before it got completely, irretrievably out of hand, before someone actually got hurt due to Brenda's reckless fabrications. I opened my front door slowly, deliberately, making sure my hands were clearly visible, and stepped out onto my porch. I called out calmly to the assembled officers, stating that I was Mark Harrison, the homeowner. I expressed my belief that there had been a significant and rather unfortunate misunderstanding. A sergeant, a man with a weathered face and tired eyes, approached me cautiously, his hand resting near his holstered weapon. He asked, sir, if I was armed. He explained that they had received a report of a potentially dangerous and volatile situation. I assured him, no, sir, I was not. The only real danger present here, I explained, was a rather heated dispute concerning the color of porch furniture and, believe it or not, the style of curtain rods. The sergeant looked understandably confused by my statement. Curtain rods? He repeated, a note of incredulity in his voice. I explained that Miss McLaughlin was their HOA president. I told him that she had come to my property that morning to complain about my porch chair and had then demanded access to my home to inspect my curtains. When I had politely but firmly asked her to leave my private property, she had apparently called 911. Behind me, I could hear Brenda protesting loudly, her voice shrill and indignant. She insisted that he was lying, that he had been threatening and hostile. She claimed once again that she had felt genuinely, terribly afraid for her life. The sergeant looked from me to Brenda to the massive, almost military-scale emergency response that was now surrounding us. He addressed Brenda directly, his voice firm but controlled. He stated, ma'am, that she had reported an armed barricade situation, a situation that, according to her, required SWAT team intervention and helicopter support. Brenda shot back, her confidence seemingly unshaken that she had reported a dangerous individual who could have been armed. In these kinds of volatile situations, she asserted, one simply couldn't be too careful. Sergeant Morrison confronted Brenda. Her false 911 claims of an armed barricade, actually a curtain dispute, had wasted massive county resources. Her confidence evaporated as he and a fire supervisor detailed the thousands in costs she was now liable for, including helicopter time. A city official arrived to discuss charges. Brenda, stammering about feeling threatened when I asked her to leave my property, watched her supporters disappear. Morrison reiterated that asking her to leave was my right, not a threat. The full cost of her theatrics, a multi-digit bill, was presented. Torres explained filing false reports was a misdemeanor, but her exaggerated demands for SWAT and special forces meant enhanced penalties. Morrison confirmed they had recordings of her lies. Brenda's face showed dawning horror. News of her public failure spread. Neighbors, no longer intimidated, shared their own stories of Brenda's abuse. At a packed emergency HOA meeting, residents recounted her harassment. Mrs. Patterson described hiding her cat in fear. Brenda's defense of enforcing standards was rebuffed. She was unanimously removed as president and from the board. Then, lawyer Tom Bradley revealed many of her violations were baseless. The prosecutor detailed how Brenda's escalated 911 calls cost taxpayers over $15,000. Judge Martinez, unimpressed by her defense, found her guilty of filing false reports and misusing emergency services. Her sentence included a large fine, full reimbursement of costs, community service, and probation. Tom Bradley, a neighborhood lawyer, advised me and others that we had strong grounds for a civil lawsuit against Brenda for harassment, emotional distress, and defamation. Ultimately, Brenda's campaign cost her nearly $60,000 in fines, reimbursements, and civil settlements. Forced to sell her Willow Creek home, her departure was quiet and humiliating. With Brenda gone, Willow Creek healed. The new HOA, led by Janet Walsh, focused on community. I sat on my porch, surrounded by my non-compliant items, at peace. My defiant curtains looked beautiful in the fading light.